She lined her room with water barrels when the blizzard hit. Elias Broder, who had hauled freight across the territory for 15 years and watched families freeze in cabins just like hers, told her plainly, "When your stove dies, that wet wall will turn your bed into a grave and take the boy with you." She had $17, two children, and no way to cut the 6 cords of wood she needed to survive. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 6 hours. But 4 months earlier, Maren Halvorstadter Vangen had never wintered alone on the open prairie in her life. She had arrived in Yankton County in the last week of August, 1887, with a borrowed mule, a trunk that held everything she still owned, and two children who had not yet learned that their father was never coming back. The claim shack sat on a rise of brown grass, 14 miles from the nearest settlement, 12 feet by 14 feet, board walls thin enough that she could see daylight through the chinks where the sod packing had crumbled, one narrow bedstead, one table with a leg that wobbled, one cast-iron cook stove that her husband had hauled from Sioux Falls the spring before, back when spring still meant something, back when he was alive to haul things. Maren Halvorsdatter Vangen stood in the doorway and let her children walk past her into the room that was supposed to keep them alive until April. Nels was 9. He had his father's square jaw and his father's way of going quiet when things turned bad. He walked to the window, pressed his palm against the glass, and said nothing. Karina was 6. She sat on the trunk and asked when Papa was coming. Maren did not answer. She crossed to the stove, opened the firebox, and looked at the ash her husband had left behind 3 months ago. Cold ash, dead ash. The stove had not been lit since the day Torstein rode out to help with the harvest haul and never rode back. The freight wagon had tipped on a rutted grade. The axle had come down across his chest. He had lived long enough to say her name, and then he had not lived at all. She had buried him in a cemetery she could not afford, in a town where she knew no one, in a territory that did not care whether she stayed or went. The minister had spoken words she did not hear. The dirt had gone onto the box. And then there was nothing left to do but come here, to this 12 by 14 room, and figure out how to survive what was coming. The woodpile told the story before anyone had to speak it. Maren walked the perimeter of the claim on her second morning. The shack sat alone on the grass. No barn, no root cellar, no windbreak worth the name. To the north, the land ran flat and open for miles, nothing to stop whatever came across it. To the south, a shallow creek bed held a few scrub willows and one dead cottonwood that had already been stripped of its lower branches. Behind the shack, stacked against the wall where Torstein had left it, was the winter wood. She counted it. She counted it again. She walked the length of the pile and measured it with her stride and her eye, the way her father had taught her when she was a girl in Hallingdal, and winter was something you prepared for like war. 1 cord, perhaps 1.5 if she counted the broken scrub and the crooked limbs that would burn fast and leave nothing. Mixed cottonwood and willow, no oak, no hard maple, nothing that would hold heat through a long night. Beside the woodpile sat 4 burlap sacks of lignite, the soft brown coal that smoked and smelled and burned too fast. 1/2 ton. Maybe less. Maren stood in the August heat and felt the winter in her bones. She had seen what happened to families who ran out of fuel. In Norway, in the high valleys, there were stories of cabins found in spring with everyone still in their beds, frozen where they slept because the fire died and no one could get up to feed it. Here on the American plains, the stories were worse. Whole families lost in a single night. Children found with their hands stretched toward stoves that had gone cold hours before. She had 1 cord of soft wood, 1/2 ton of bad coal, $17 in cash, 2 children, and a shack with walls so thin she could feel the wind through them even now in August when the wind was warm. The math did not work. The math could not work, and there was no one coming to make it work for her. The first visitor arrived on the third day. She heard the horse before she saw it. A heavy draft animal, moving slow, carrying a man who sat the saddle like he had been sitting saddles for 40 years and saw no reason to sit them any differently now. Elias Broder. She would learn his name later. What she learned first was his face, weathered to the color of old leather, seamed with lines that ran deep around his eyes and deeper around his mouth, a face that had seen things freeze and things die and had stopped being surprised by either. He did not dismount. He sat his horse in front of her door and looked at the shack the way a man looks at a coffin before the lid goes on. "You're the Vangen widow," he said. It was not a question. Maren stood in the doorway with Karina pressed against her skirt. "I am." Torstein Vangen's claim. He filed it in 63, proved it up in 68. He's been working it 9 years. Broder shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "Now he's dead, and you're here." "Yes." "You know what you're looking at." "A homestead." "You're looking at a death sentence." Broder swung down from the horse. He was not a tall man, but he moved with the economy of someone who had learned to save his strength for things that mattered. He walked past her without asking permission, ducked through the doorway, and stood in the middle of her shack with his hands on his hips. He kicked the wall. The board shuddered. "Half-inch pine," he said. "Sod chinking, already crumbling. No proper storm door. One window, north-facing, single pane. You might as well be sleeping in a tent." He crossed to the stove, opened the firebox, looked inside, closed it again. 20-inch box, fair enough for cooking, not enough for heating a room this size when the real cold comes. "I know the stove is small." "Small?" Broder made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Ma'am, I've been hauling freight across this territory for 15 years. Before that, I was with the Army, running supply wagons out of Fort Randall. I've seen what cold does. I've seen men freeze standing up. I've seen families go to sleep in January and never wake up." He turned to face her. "This stove is not small. This stove is a lie someone told you about staying alive." Maren felt Karina's fingers tighten on her skirt. She kept her voice level. "What would you have me do?" "Sell the claim. Take your children back east. Find family who can help you." "I have no family. I have no fare. If I sell this claim, I sell the only thing my children might inherit." "If you stay here, they'll inherit a grave." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Karina made a small sound. Nels, sitting on the bed, stared at the floor. Broder walked to the door, stopped, and turned back. "I'm a claim inspector, Mrs. Vangen. I've been appointed by the territorial office to assess homesteads in this district. I'm not here to frighten you. I'm here to tell you what I see." He pulled a small notebook from his coat, flipped it open, and read aloud as he wrote. 12 by 14 feet, board walls, sod chinking, poor repair, cast iron cook stove, 20-inch firebox, fuel on hand. He looked at her. "How much wood?" "1 cord, maybe 1.5. "Lignite?" "Half a ton." Broder wrote it down. "You need 6 cords minimum for a hard winter, 8 if January turns bad. You've got less than 2. He closed the notebook. "You need a proper storm door, or the wind will steal your heat faster than you can make it. You need someone waking twice a night to feed that stove. You need food stores for 4 months, because once the snow sets in, you won't be going anywhere." He paused. "You have none of this. I know what I don't have. Do you know what you're facing? A real Dakota cold snap drops 40, 50 degrees in a few hours. I've seen it hit 70. The air turns to knives. Your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Water freezes in the bucket beside your bed. And your stove," he pointed at the cast iron box. "Your stove can only put out so much. When the heat goes out faster than you can put it in, the room dies. And then the people in it die. He pulled on his gloves. A cabin doesn't survive on ideas, Mrs. Van Gen. It survives on wood. He walked to his horse, mounted, and gathered the reins. I'll note in my report that the claim is occupied. I'll note the conditions. What happens next is between you and God. He touched his hat. Ma'am. He rode south toward the settlement and did not look back. Maren stood in the doorway and watched him go until he was a dark speck on the brown horizon. Then she turned and looked at her children. Nels had not moved from the bed. Karina was crying silently, the way she had learned to cry since her father died. Maren knelt beside her daughter and took her face in both hands. Listen to me, she said. That man counted wood and walls. He counted what he could see. He did not count everything. Karina sniffled. What didn't he count? Maren did not have an answer. Not yet. But she looked at the stove, at the thin walls, at the single window with frost already forming in its corners, even in the August damp, and something in the back of her mind began to stir. Something her father had shown her long ago, in a cold valley very far from here. He didn't count me, she said. The memory came back to her that night. She lay in the narrow bed with both children pressed against her, Nels on one side, Karina on the other. The shack creaked in the wind. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the prairie made sounds she had not yet learned to name, the rustle of grass, the far-off cry of something hunting, the vast silence underneath everything. And in that silence, she remembered her father's hands. She had been 7, maybe 8. A winter in Hallingdal, in the farmhouse where 3 generations had lived and died and lived again. The stove in the main room was a massive thing, cast iron and soapstone, the kind of stove that held heat for hours after the fire died. But it was not the stove she remembered. It was what her father kept beside it. Crocks, stoneware crocks, the kind her mother used for pickling and preserving. 4 of them, large ones filled with water, and arranged in a half circle near the stove's base. She had asked him why. Cold iron bites fast, he had said, but warmed water gives the room back slowly. She had not understood. She was 7. She understood that water was for drinking and washing and not much else. But she remembered the feel of those crocks at night when she crept out of bed to use the privy. Warm, still warm, hours after her father had banked the fire. The room never crashed into killing cold the way the unheated rooms did. The temperature fell, but slowly, gently, as if the night had to negotiate with those crocks of water before it could claim the space. She had not thought about those crocks in 20 years, but lying in a shack on the Dakota prairie with Elias Broder's words still ringing in her ears, she thought about them now. Water holds warmth. Water gives it back slowly. The idea was so simple it felt almost like nothing, but the more she turned it over in her mind, the more it began to take shape. Broder had told her she couldn't make enough heat, but what if the problem wasn't making heat? What if the problem was keeping it? Her stove could warm the room during the day when she was awake to feed it. But at night, when the fire burned low, the heat bled out through those thin board walls faster than the stove could replace it. By morning, the room was cold. By a bad morning, the room was deadly. What if she could store the heat? What if she could capture it during the day, hold it in something that didn't cool as fast as air, and let it bleed back into the room through the long night? Water. A lot of water. More water than crocks could hold. Barrels. She lay in the dark with her children breathing beside her, and she thought about barrels. The idea grew stronger over the following days. She walked the claim again, measuring everything with her eye. The shack was 12 by 14, 168 square feet. Not large, but not the smallest she had seen. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet at the peak. The stove sat in the northwest corner, its pipe running up through the roof. If she placed water-filled barrels along the walls, especially the north and west walls where the cold would hit hardest, they would absorb heat from the stove during the day. At night, when the fire died down, they would release that heat slowly back into the room, not hot. She did not expect them to make the room hot, but warm enough that the temperature would not crash from tolerable to deadly in a few hours. Warm enough that her children might wake up in the morning. The numbers began to form in her mind. 20 barrels, large ones, 40 to 50 gallons each, arranged along 2 walls stacked too high where the floor could bear it. That was, she calculated, 800 to 1,000 gallons of water, tons of thermal mass sitting inside her shack like a second set of walls. The idea was insane. She knew it was insane even as she thought it. Barrels leaked, water froze, damp air bred sickness. The weight alone might collapse her floor. Every practical objection Elias Broder could have raised, she raised against herself first. But she kept coming back to her father's crocs. They had worked. She remembered that they had worked, and she had no other option. No money for more wood, no family to take her in. No way off this claim that did not mean losing everything. If the barrels failed, she would die. But if she did nothing, she would die anyway. At least the barrels were a chance. She needed to find out if the chance was real. Hannah Peebles came to call on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after Marin's arrival. Hannah was a practical woman, built solid, with hands that showed years of work and a face that showed years of worry. She had homesteaded 3 miles east with her husband and 4 children, and she had come to see what kind of neighbor the Van Gen widow would be. She brought a loaf of bread. She brought news of the settlement, who had a good harvest, who had a bad one, who had given up and gone back east. She brought the easy chatter of a woman who had not had another woman to talk to in weeks. And then Marin told her about the barrels. The chatter stopped. "You want to fill your shack with water?" Hannah said. "Not fill it. Line the walls, 20 barrels stacked along the north and west sides. The stove heats the water during the day. The water holds the heat through the night." Hannah set down her cup. Her face had gone from curious to concerned, to something that looked like fear. Marin, water freezes. Not if the room stays warm enough. The barrels will help keep it warm. And if the room doesn't stay warm enough, if your stove dies in the night and you wake up surrounded by ice, then I'm no worse off than I would have been without the barrels. You're worse off because you've filled your house with ice, ice that will take heat to melt, ice that will make the room colder, not warmer. Hannah shook her head. "I've seen what happens when water freezes inside a cabin. The wood rots. The damp gets into everything. Children get lung fever. You could kill them faster with barrels than without. I could kill them faster by doing nothing. There are other options." "Name them." Hannah opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at the floor. The silence stretched. Finally, she said, "You could come to us when the worst weather hits. Pack up the children and come stay with us." "And if the worst weather lasts 2 weeks, 3? You have 4 children of your own, Hannah. You have your own fuel to worry about. How long before we become a burden you can't carry?" "You wouldn't be I would be. We both know it." Marin leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to believe in my barrels. I'm not asking anyone to believe. But I have no other way. The math doesn't work. The inspector came and told me the math doesn't work, and he was right. So I have to change the math." Hannah sat in silence for a long moment. Then she gathered her shawl and stood. "I'll pray for you," she said. "I'll pray for those children. But I think you're making a terrible mistake." She left the bread on the table. Marin sat alone in the quiet shack and listened to the sound of hoofbeats fading east. The problem with barrels was finding them. Marin had $17, A single new barrel, coopered tight and properly hooped, cost somewhere between $2 and $4, depending on size and quality. 20 new barrels would cost more money than she had. 20 new barrels was impossible, but used barrels were different. She walked to the settlement on a Thursday morning, leaving Nels in charge of Karina with strict instructions not to open the door to anyone and not to let the fire die. The walk took 3 hours. Her boots were worn thin, and the road was rutted hard from wagon traffic, but she made it to the main street by noon. The settlement was not much: a general store, a feed merchant, a livery, a blacksmith, a saloon that also served as a post office, a church that also served as a schoolhouse. Perhaps 200 people lived within a mile of the crossing, and most of them were getting ready for winter. She went to the livery first. The liveryman was named Trask. He was tall and thin and missing 2 fingers on his left hand. He looked at Marin the way men looked at women who showed up alone asking for things. "Barrels," he said. "Yes, large ones, 40 to 50 gallons. "What for?" She had prepared for this question. "Storage. I need to store water for the winter." "Most folks dig a well or melt snow." "I need barrels." Trask shrugged. "I've got 3 out back that held molasses. They're scraped but not clean. Hoops are loose on one. $2 each. Take them as they are." "I'll give you $4 for all 3. I'll tighten the hoops myself." He studied her. Then he nodded. $4. You'll haul them?" "I'll arrange hauling." She paid him from her dwindling stack of coins and moved on. The general store had nothing. The blacksmith had 1 barrel that had held nails. He wanted $3 for it and would not bargain. She paid. By late afternoon, she had found 6 barrels. She had spent $9. She had 11 barrels still to find and $8 left. And then she walked past the feed merchant's yard. Silas Creel was standing on his porch, watching her. He was a heavy man, soft in the middle but hard in the face. He wore a vest with a gold watch chain and boots that had been polished recently. His yard was stacked with cordwood, split and seasoned, enough fuel to heat a dozen cabins through a dozen winters. Business was good for Silas Creel. Business was always good for Silas Creel, because winter always came, and people always needed what he sold. "Mrs. Vangen," he said, "I heard you were in town." Marin stopped. "Mr. Creel." "Buying barrels, I hear. Quite a lot of barrels." Word traveled fast in a settlement this small. She should have expected it. "I need them for the homestead." "Storage, I suppose. Water storage." He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Lot of water for 1 woman and 2 children." "I have my reasons." "I'm sure you do." Creel stepped off the porch and walked toward her. He stopped close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "I also hear you're short on fuel. Dangerously short. The kind of short that gets people killed." "I'm managing." "Managing?" He looked at her the way Elias Broder had looked at her shack, like something already dead that hadn't realized it yet. "Mrs. Vangen, I've been selling wood and coal in this territory for 12 years. I know what managing looks like, and I know what dying looks like. You're a lot closer to dying." "Is there a point to this, Mr. Creel?" "The point is, I can help you." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper. "I've drawn up a fuel note, 6 cords of oak, delivered to your claim on credit. You pay me back after the spring thaw, plus interest, of course. Standard terms." Marin did not reach for the paper. "What interest?" 20%. 20% of what?" "Of the value of your claim. If you can't pay in cash, I take a lien on the land." Creel's smile widened. "Fair terms, Mrs. Vangen, generous terms, considering your situation." Marin understood exactly what was happening. Creel was not offering her a lifeline. He was offering her a noose. 20% of her claim's value. She could not calculate it exactly, but she knew it would be more than she could pay in spring. The note was designed to trap her. One bad winter, one missed payment, and Creel would own everything Torstein had worked 9 years to build. She had seen this before. In Norway, the wealthy landlords had done the same thing to struggling farmers. Different country, same trap. "No," she said. Creel's smile flickered. "No? I won't sign your note. I won't take your credit. I'll find another way." "There is no other way." "Then I'll make one." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard Creel laugh. "The barrels," he called after her. "I heard about your barrels. You're going to fill your shack with water and call it wintering. That's your other way?" He laughed again, louder. "When your stove dies, Mrs. Vangen, that wet wall will turn your bed into a grave and take the boy with you." Maren did not turn around. She kept walking until she reached the edge of the settlement, and then she kept walking some more. CTA 1. If this story of a widow fighting impossible odds speaks to you, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next will test everything she believes. The damaged barrels found her. 3 days after her confrontation with Creel, a wagon pulled up to her claim at dusk. The driver was a young man she did not recognize, perhaps 18, with a sunburned face and nervous hands. "Mrs. Vangen?" "Yes." "Mr. Anselm Rook sent me. Said you were looking for barrels." The young man gestured at the wagon bed. 7 of them. Came from the old tannery before it closed. Got cracks and loose staves, some of them. Maren stared at the barrels. 7, plus the 6 she already had. 13 total. Who is Anselm Rook? He used to run the boiler house at the mill before his leg went bad. Lives out on the East Fork now, alone mostly. Heard you were looking, asked around, found these. Said to tell you they're free if you can use them, otherwise he'll haul them back and burn them for firewood. Free. 7 barrels, free. Tell Mr. Rook I can use them, and tell him, she stopped. Tell him I'd like to meet him, when he has time. The young man nodded, helped her unload the barrels onto the grass beside her shack, and drove away. Maren stood in the fading light, looking at 13 barrels, and felt the first faint spark of something that might have been hope. Anselm Rook came himself 2 days later. He walked with a heavy limp, dragging his left leg behind him like something that had been broken and never properly set. He was 63 years old, though he looked older. White hair cropped short, face like crumpled paper, hands that were missing the tip of one finger and scarred across both palms. But his eyes were sharp. His eyes missed nothing. He stood in front of her shack and looked at it the way Elias Broder had, but different. Broder had looked at it like a coffin. Rook looked at it like a problem to be solved. "You're the barrel woman," he said. "I suppose I am." "You know what you're doing?" "No, but I know what I'm trying to do." Rook grunted. He limped past her, entered the shack without asking, and spent 5 minutes looking at everything: the walls, the stove, the floor, the ceiling, the placement of the bed and the table, and the single window. He tapped the boards with his knuckle. He opened the stove and looked inside. He pressed his palm flat against the north wall and held it there for a long moment. Then he turned to face her. "You're trying to build a heat sink," he said. "Water mass along the walls to absorb daytime heat and release it at night." Maren felt her heart jump. "You understand it." "Understand it? Girl, I worked a boiler house for 22 years. I've forgotten more about heat transfer than most people will ever know." He limped to the center of the room and stood where the stove's warmth was strongest. "The principle is sound. Water holds heat better than air, better than wood, better than iron. You stack enough of it around your living space, you slow down the cooling curve. Night takes longer to kill you. But, but there are 100 ways to do it wrong. He pointed at the floor. Your joists are undersized. 20 barrels of water is going to weigh upwards of 8,000 pounds. You put that weight on this floor without proper support. You're sleeping in a hole by Christmas. Marin's hope flickered. Can it be fixed? Can be braced? Cribbed planks under the barrel rose, weight distributed to the sills. It's work, but it's doable. He pointed at the stove. Your stove placement is wrong. Too close to the corner. The heat radiates into the wall instead of into the barrels. You need a reflector, tin sheet, angled behind the stove, throwing heat into the room. I can move the stove. You can try. Cast iron that size. You'll need help. He looked at her. You've got help? I have 2 children and no husband. Rook was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I heard about Torstein. Heard he was a good man. He was. And I hear his widow is either clever or crazy, depending on who's telling the story. What do you think? Rook limped to the door, leaned against the frame, and looked out at the prairie. I think you're thinking in systems, he said. I think you looked at a problem everybody else sees as simple, cold room, need more fire, and you saw it differently. You saw it as a heat budget, income and outgo, and you're trying to change the outgo because you can't change the income. He turned back to face her. That's not crazy. That's engineering. Will you help me? Why should I? Because I can't do it alone. And because, she hesitated, because I think you want to see if it works. Rook stared at her for a long moment. His scarred hands hung at his sides. His ruined leg bore his weight without complaint. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. We'll start with the floor bracing. Bring your barrels inside and we'll see what we're working with. He limped out into the afternoon sun. Marin watched him go, this strange, broken man who had appeared out of nowhere to tell her she was not insane. Tomorrow they would begin. The work started at dawn on a cold morning in early September. Rook arrived with a mule cart loaded with scrap lumber, planks, and boards salvaged from somewhere he did not explain, rough cut and unfinished, but solid. He showed Marin how to measure the floor joists, how to identify the weak spots, how to cut and fit cribbing that would spread the barrel weight across the structure instead of concentrating it in single points. Weight distribution, he said, driving a wedge under a plank. First rule of moving heavy things. The load doesn't care how much it weighs. It only cares how much weight sits on any one spot. Marin learned. She watched him work, then copied what he did. Her hands blistered on the saw and the hammer. Her shoulders ached from lifting planks. Nels helped where he could, carrying smaller pieces, holding things steady while the adults worked. By the end of the first day, they had braced 3 sections of floor. By the end of the 3rd day, the entire north wall was ready to bear weight. Then they began the barrels. The damaged ones came first. Rook showed her how to assess a barrel, tapping the staves to check for rot, examining the hoops for rust, testing the seams for gaps where water would weep through. Pitch, he said, holding up a tin of black tar. You seal the inside seams with pitch before you fill them. Soak the staves, then pitch them, then fill them slow. A good barrel holds water for years. A bad barrel holds it for hours. They worked through the first barrel together. Rook talked while they worked, explaining each step, making her repeat the process until she could do it without thinking. By dusk, the first barrel sat in the corner of the shack, sealed and watertight, ready to be filled. Marin looked at it, one barrel, standing alone against the wall, and felt the enormity of what remained. 19 more. plus the floor bracing, plus the stove repositioning, plus the hauling of water from the creek, bucket by bucket, to fill 1,000 gallons. How long? She asked. Rook leaned on his good leg and did the calculation. If we work every day, if the weather holds, if nothing breaks that we can't fix, 6 weeks, maybe 8. And if the cold comes early, then we work faster. Outside, the September sun was setting red and gold over the prairie. The first hint of autumn was in the air, that crispness that meant the season was turning. That time was running short. Marin looked at the single barrel, then at the empty walls, then at her children sitting on the bed watching her with eyes that still did not understand what she was trying to do. 6 weeks. Maybe 8. And then whatever came after. She picked up the hammer and started on the second barrel. Chunk 2 continues. The second week brought the first real setback. Barrel number 8 had looked sound when Marin pitched it. The staves were tight, the hoops were firm, and the seams held water for the first 2 days without complaint. She had filled it, positioned it against the north wall beside its brothers, and moved on to the next. On the morning of the third day, Karina woke her before dawn. "Mama, the floor is wet." Marin rose from the bed in the gray half-light and felt it immediately, the cold seep of water under her bare feet, spreading across the boards in a dark stain. Barrel 8 had split along a hidden crack in one stave, invisible until the water pressure found it and forced it open. 40 gallons of carefully hauled creek water now pooled across her floor, soaking into the wood, spreading toward the bed. She spent the morning bailing, bucket after bucket, carried outside and dumped on the frozen grass. By the time the floor was dry enough to walk on, her back ached and her hands were raw, and the sun was high and she had lost half a day's work. Rook arrived at noon and assessed the damage without comment. He pulled the failed barrel outside, examined the split stave, and shook his head. "Rot," he said. "Hidden under the surface. You can't always see it. You can't always test for it." He looked at her. "This will happen again. Maybe once, maybe twice. It's part of the work. I can't afford to lose barrels. Then you learn to spot the bad ones before they fail, and you keep spare staves on hand for repairs." He limped back toward the shack. "Today we fix. Tomorrow we continue." They spent the afternoon cannibalizing staves from a barrel too damaged to save, fitting them into the split one, rehooping and repitching until it held water again. By dusk, barrel 8 was back in position against the wall. But Marin had learned something. The work was not linear. Progress could be unmade in a single night. Every barrel that went up was a barrel that might come down. She would have to be vigilant. She would have to check every seam, every hoop, every morning. The water wall was not something you built once. It was something you maintained forever. The third week brought Elias Browder back. He rode up to the claim on a Thursday afternoon, the same heavy draft horse, the same weathered face. But this time he did not stay mounted. He swung down, tied his horse to the post, and walked toward the shack with purpose. Marin met him at the door. "Mr. Browder, Mrs. Vangen." He looked past her into the interior of the shack. His eyebrows rose. "You've been busy." 9 barrels stood along the north wall, stacked in 2 rows where the floor could bear it. Another 3 sat along the west wall, waiting to be joined by their brothers. The room had shrunk. The living space that had felt cramped before now felt positively tiny, hemmed in by curved wooden walls that sweated faintly in the warmth from the stove. Browder walked inside without asking. He moved slowly down the line of barrels, tapping each one with his knuckle, listening to the sound. "Full," he said. "All of them?" "All of them." 40 gallons each?" "More or less." He did the calculation in his head. That's nearly 400 gallons, 3,000 pounds of water, give or take. He stamped his boot on the floor. Your joists? Braced, cribbed planks underneath, weight distributed to the sills. Broder's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He had expected to find foolishness. He was finding something else. You had help, he said. Anselm Rook, the boiler man. Broder nodded slowly. I know Rook, knows his business, what's left of him. He turned to face her. This doesn't change my assessment, Mrs. Vangen. Water is not wood. Heat capacity is not survival. You're gambling your children's lives on a theory. I'm gambling their lives on the only chance I have. You could still sell. The claim has value. Someone would buy it even now. And go where? Do what? Beg in the streets of Sioux Falls until someone takes pity on us? Marin shook her head. This is what we have, Mr. Broder. This shack, this land, these barrels. If it's not enough, then nothing would have been enough. But I'm not going to die waiting to find out. Broder stood in the middle of her barrel-lined room, surrounded by water and wood and the smell of pitch, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he pulled out his notebook. I'll update my report, he said. I'll note that you've undertaken modifications to the structure. I'll note that you have help. He closed the notebook. I still think you're going to die here, but I've been wrong before. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back. Mild cold proves nothing, he said. When the real test comes, and it will come, your barrels will either save you or kill you. There won't be anything in between. He rode away toward the south. Marin watched him go, then turned back to the work. 11 barrels done, 9 to go. The fourth week brought Hannah Peebles back, but not alone. She arrived with her oldest boy, a lanky 14-year-old named Marcus, who had his mother's practical hands and his father's reluctant silence. They stood in Marin's doorway, Hannah looking uncomfortable, Marcus looking at the floor. I heard about your barrels, Hannah said. The whole district's heard about your barrels. Silas Creel's been telling everyone you've lost your mind. Has he? He says you're building a fever room, says the damp will kill your children before the cold gets the chance. Hannah's voice was tight. I told him he was talking nonsense. I told him you knew what you were doing. Do you believe that? Hannah hesitated. Then she said, I don't know what I believe, but I know you're still here. I know you haven't given up, and I know, she pushed Marcus forward gently, I know you need help, and I've got a boy who can lift more than I can spare from the house. Marin looked at Marcus. The boy met her eyes for a moment, then looked away again. One afternoon, Hannah said. That's all I can give you. But he's strong, and he does what he's told. Why? Because I've been where you are. Hannah's voice dropped. Not exactly, but close enough. And someone helped me once when I didn't deserve it and couldn't repay it. So now I'm helping you. She stepped back. I still think those barrels are dangerous, but I'd rather be wrong about the barrels than right about letting you do this alone. Marcus spent the afternoon rolling barrels into position, while Marin and Rook worked on the stove repositioning. He did not speak much, but he worked steadily, and when he left at dusk, 3 more barrels stood in their places along the west wall, 14 down, 6 to go. Rook taught her the stove trick on a cold morning in late September. They had wrestled the cast-iron cook stove away from the corner, a job that took both of them plus a borrowed lever and most of a morning, and repositioned it 18 inches out from the wall. Behind it, Rook had mounted a sheet of salvaged tin, angled to reflect heat back into the room instead of letting it soak uselessly into the boards. Heat moves, he said, adjusting the angle of the tin. It radiates from the source in all directions. Most stoves, half the heat goes into the wall behind them. Wasted. This, he tapped the tin sheet. This catches that half and throws it back. You just doubled your stove's effectiveness without burning a single extra stick. Marin studied the arrangement. My father never did this. Your father had a soapstone stove in a proper house. Different situation. Rook stepped back and surveyed his work. This is improvisation. This is making do with what you have. It's not elegant, but elegant doesn't keep you alive. What else? What else what? What else don't I know? What else is going to surprise me when the cold comes? Rook was quiet for a moment. He limped to the nearest barrel, laid his palm flat against the wood, and held it there. The barrels will stratify, he said. Warm water rises, cold water sinks. The top of each barrel will be warmer than the bottom. That's good. It means the warm layer is closest to the room air, but it also means the cold layer is closest to your floor. He looked at her. Put rugs down, thick ones if you have them. Keep your children's feet off the bare boards. What else? Your stovepipe. When the fire burns hot, the pipe gets hot. When the fire dies, the pipe cools. If the pipe cools too fast, you get downdraft cold air pushing back down the chimney into your room. You'll know it's happening because you'll smell smoke even with the flue open. How do I stop it? You don't stop it, you manage it. Keep a low fire burning through the night instead of letting it die completely. A handful of coal every few hours, enough to keep the pipe warm, not enough to waste fuel. He paused. You'll be waking up anyway. Might as well wake up for a reason. Marin absorbed this. Every lesson Rook taught her felt like a door opening into a room she hadn't known existed. The world of heat and cold, of energy moving through materials, of systems that could be understood and manipulated. It was a world she had glimpsed in her father's crocs and was now learning to inhabit fully. You know a lot, she said. I've had time to learn. Rook's voice was flat. 22 years in a boiler house, 3 more work in the railroad before my leg went. I've watched men die because they didn't understand how heat moves. I've watched buildings burn because someone didn't respect what fire could do. He looked at her. Heat is not your friend, Mrs. Van Gen. Neither is cold. They're forces. You learn to work with them or they kill you. That's all there is. Why are you helping me? The question hung in the air. Rook did not answer immediately. He turned away, looked out the window at the brown prairie stretching to the horizon, and was silent for a long time. Because I'm old, he said finally. Because I'm alone. Because I spent my life working for other people's comfort and never built anything of my own. He turned back. And because when I look at you, at what you're trying to do, I see someone thinking the way I used to think. Like the world is a puzzle that can be solved if you're stubborn enough and smart enough and willing to work. He smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. I want to see if you can solve it. I want to be here when you do. He limped toward the door. Same time tomorrow. We'll start on the barrel arrangement, get them positioned for maximum heat absorption. It matters more than you think. October arrived cold and stayed cold. The first hard frost came on the 3rd of the month, painting the windows with crystals and turning the creek to sluggish ice at the edges. Marin woke that morning to find her breath visible in the shack, the stove reduced to embers, the barrels along the wall cool to the touch but not cold. She had her first data point. The room had dropped in temperature overnight, but not catastrophically. The barrels had done something. She could not measure it precisely, but she could feel it, the difference between the killing cold outside and the survivable cold inside. The gap was not large, but it was there. She fed the stove, made breakfast for the children, and marked the date in her mind. October 3rd. First frost. First test. First sign that the theory might be more than theory. The last barrel went into place on October 19th. 20 barrels arranged in two staggered rows along the north and west walls. 800 gallons of water. Nearly 4 tons of thermal mass standing between her family and the winter. Maren stood in the center of the shrunken room and looked at what she had built. The space was cramped now, the bed pushed tight against the south wall, the table angled into the only clear corner, the stove repositioned with its tin reflector throwing heat toward the barrel rows. Walking from one end of the room to the other meant squeezing between barrel staves and ducking under the low ceiling of the loft. There was no room for comfort. There was barely room for living. But there was heat. She could feel it in the air, in the wood, in the water that surrounded her on two sides like the embrace of something vast and patient. The barrels did not make the room warm. They made the room less cold, which was not the same thing, but was close enough to matter. Rook stood beside her, surveying the completed work. "You've done it," he said. "Whether it works or not, you've done what you set out to do. It has to work. It has to work in a mild winter. It has to work when the fuel holds out. It has to work when nothing goes wrong." He shook his head. "Real tests don't come on schedule, Mrs. Vangen. Real tests come when everything's already gone sideways. That's when we'll know." "When will we know?" "When a bad night comes and you wake up in the morning." He limped toward the door. "I'll check on you weekly. Keep your fuel dry, keep your stove fed, keep your barrels sealed, and pray for a gentle winter." He left. Maren stood alone in her barrel-lined room, listening to the wind pick up outside, and did not pray for a gentle winter. She prayed for a winter she could survive. November passed in a rhythm of maintenance and waiting. Every morning, check the barrels for leaks, check the floor for damp, check the stovepipe for creosote buildup, check the fuel supply, counting cords and sacks, calculating burn rates against remaining time. Every evening, feed the stove for the night. Position the children in the warmest part of the room, the alcove between the barrel rows where the heat concentrated. Bank the fire low enough to last, but high enough to keep the pipe warm. Sleep lightly, listening for the sounds of trouble. The early winter was not kind, but it was not killing. Temperatures dropped into single digits, rose again, dropped again. Snow fell, melted, fell again. The barrels performed as expected, absorbing heat during the day, releasing it through the long nights, keeping the temperature drop gradual instead of catastrophic. Maren began to believe. She marked her observations in a small notebook Rook had given her. Morning temperature by the bed. Evening temperature after the stove burned hot. How much fuel consumed. How much water lost to evaporation. The numbers were crude. She had no proper thermometer, only a simple alcohol tube that Rook had calibrated for her, but they told a story. The story said the system was working. Elias Broder came by once, in late November, and stood in her doorway without entering. "Still alive," he said. "Still alive. The real cold hasn't come yet." "I know." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself, and rode away without another word. The real cold came on January 12th, 1888. Maren would remember that morning for the rest of her life. It began wrong and got worse. Nels had woken with a fever 3 days earlier. Not a bad fever at first, the kind of low heat that children sometimes ran in winter, nothing that a few days in bed and some willow bark tea wouldn't cure. But the fever had not broken. It had settled in stubbornly, and by the morning of January 12th, Nels was too weak to sit up and too hot to touch without flinching. Maren had not slept. She had spent the night moving between the stove and the bed, feeding the fire, checking her son's temperature, listening to his breathing grow thicker and wetter as the hours passed. By dawn, she was exhausted and terrified, and in no condition for what was about to happen. The day began warm, deceptively, treacherously warm, temperatures near freezing, a mild wind from the south, the kind of January morning that made people believe winter was loosening its grip. Maren felt the warmth through the walls of her shack and felt something else. Unease. She had lived through enough Norwegian winters to know that warm days in January were not gifts. They were warnings. By noon, the wind had shifted. She felt it before she saw it, a change in the air, a drop in pressure, something animal and ancient that made the hairs rise on her arms. She went to the window and looked north. The sky was wrong. A wall of cloud was rolling in from the northwest, dark as bruises, moving faster than any weather she had seen. The cloud wall ate the horizon as she watched, swallowing farms and fields and the distant smudge of the settlement. The warm wind died. For a moment, everything went still. Then the cold hit. It did not arrive gradually. It crashed into the claim like a physical blow, a wave of Arctic air that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in the time it took to gasp. The window glass, warm a moment before, turned to ice under her palm. The boards of the shack groaned. Outside, the chickens began screaming. Maren had perhaps 30 seconds to act. She threw open the stove door and fed it everything within reach. 3 armloads of split cottonwood, a scoop of lignite, kindling and scraps, and the broken leg of a chair she had been saving for an emergency. The fire roared up, throwing heat into the room with desperate intensity. She closed the door, opened the damper wide, and turned to her children. Nels, Karina, into the center of the room, now. Don't touch the walls, don't touch the window, stay by the barrels. Karina obeyed instantly, scrambling off the bed and pressing herself against the nearest barrel row. Nels tried to rise and fell back, too weak to stand. Maren gathered him in her arms. He was burning with fever, light as kindling, and carried him to the warmest spot, the alcove between the barrel rows where the heat concentrated. Outside, the world was disappearing. The wind hit next. Not wind, as Maren understood wind, but something horizontal and howling, driving snow so thick and fast that the window turned white in seconds. The shack shuddered. A crack ran up one board on the north wall. The temperature inside, which had been comfortable moments before, began to fall. Maren could feel it, the cold pressing in from every direction, finding every gap in the boards, every chink in the sod, every weakness in the structure. Her barrels stood against that cold like soldiers in a line, absorbing the assault, giving back the heat they had stored. But the assault was massive. The assault was unlike anything she had prepared for. She fed the stove again, and again, and again. The first hour was manageable. The stove burned hot. The barrels held their heat. The room temperature dropped, but did not crash. Maren moved between the fire and her children, checking Nels's fever, reassuring Karina, maintaining the thin line between survival and catastrophe. The second hour brought the first crisis. The stovepipe began to moan, a low, eerie sound that meant the wind outside was creating pressure differentials, trying to force air down through the chimney. Smoke began to seep back into the room, thin gray wisps at first, then thicker plumes that made Karina cough and sent Maren scrambling for the damper. She remembered Rook's words. Downdraft. Cold air pushing back down the chimney. You'll know it's happening because you'll smell smoke even with the flue open. She adjusted the damper, not closed, not open, but somewhere in between, a position she found through trial and error while her eyes watered and her children pressed cloths over their mouths. The smoke thinned, the fire steadied, but she had lost 15 minutes, and in those 15 minutes, the room had dropped 3 degrees. The third hour brought the second crisis. Nels's fever spiked. He had been lying quietly between the barrel rows, wrapped in every blanket Marin owned, drifting in and out of a fitful sleep. But in the third hour, he began to shake. Not shiver, shake. His whole body convulsing, his teeth chattering so hard she could hear them across the room, his skin burning hot even as he complained of cold. Marin had seen fever chills before. She knew they could be dangerous, a body fighting so hard against infection that it exhausted itself. She knew Nels needed warmth, needed fluids, needed rest. She also knew that if she focused entirely on Nels, she would lose the fire. And if she lost the fire, she would lose everyone. She made a choice. She positioned Karina beside her brother with instructions to keep him covered and keep him drinking water from the cup beside the bed. Then she turned back to the stove and did not look away again. The fire had to live. The fire was the only thing generating new heat. The barrels could slow the loss, but they could not stop it. They could buy time, but they could not buy survival. Only the fire could do that, and the fire needed to be fed. She fed it. Hour after hour through the howling afternoon, she fed it. If you need to know whether this mother and her children survived the night, hit subscribe now because the next hours will decide everything. The fourth hour brought news from outside. A pounding at the door, frantic, desperate, barely audible over the wind. Marin wrenched it open and found Hannah Peebles' husband, Lars, coated in ice, his face white with cold and fear. "Our stove," he gasped. The pipe cracked. We can't keep the fire going. The children." Marin pulled him inside and slammed the door against the wind. "How many?" "6. Hannah, the 4 children, my mother. We tried to patch it, but the crack keeps spreading. The room's already below freezing. If we don't find shelter," his voice broke. "Please. I know there's no room. I know we're asking too much, but please." Marin looked at her shack, the cramped space, the barrel rows, the sick boy, the single stove struggling against the cold, and calculated. "Bring them," she said. "Quickly, before you lose anyone on the way." Lars disappeared into the white. Marin turned to Karina. "We're going to have visitors. Help me move the table. We need to make room." The fifth hour brought the Peebles family. They came in a stumbling line through the storm, Lars carrying his youngest, Hannah carrying the baby, the older children clinging to each other, Lars's elderly mother wrapped in so many blankets she could barely walk. They fell through the door like refugees from a shipwreck, ice in their hair, ice on their clothes, ice in the creases of their skin. Marin's shack had been cramped with 4 people. With 11, it was impossible. Bodies pressed against bodies. Children sat on laps or squeezed between barrel rows. The floor disappeared under a carpet of legs and feet and blankets. But the barrels held. Marin had worried 11 people breathing, 11 people giving off their own heat, but also 11 people drawing heat from the room. Would the system handle the load? Would the additional bodies help or hurt? The answer came within the hour. The temperature, which had been falling steadily, stabilized. Then slowly, impossibly, it began to rise. The people were helping. 11 bodies, each one generating heat like a small furnace. Combined with the stove, combined with the barrels, combined with the reduced air volume of the packed room, the heat budget had shifted. More coming in than going out. For the first time since the storm hit, Marin's shack was gaining ground. Hannah pressed her face into Marin's shoulder and wept. "The barrels," she whispered. "My God, Marin, the barrels!" The 6th hour brought the darkest moment. The storm did not relent. Outside, the wind had passed through, howling into something beyond sound, a constant pressure, a weight against the walls, a force that felt less like weather and more like intent. The shack creaked and groaned. One board on the north wall bowed inward, pressed by drifting snow. A thin line of powder snow began to sift through a crack in the ceiling, and then the fuel ran low. Marin had burned through her reserves faster than planned. The crisis had demanded it. Now, in the 6th hour, she looked at what remained: half a sack of lignite, perhaps 2 armloads of split wood, some scraps and kindling. Enough for another 3 hours, maybe 4 if she rationed ruthlessly. The storm showed no sign of ending. She made a decision. She reduced the fire, not all the way, but significantly, letting it settle from a roar to a steady burn. The temperature would drop. The drop would be slower than it would have been without the barrels, but it would still drop. She was buying time at the cost of comfort. "What are you doing?" Lars asked. "Stretching the fuel. We have to make it last until the storm breaks." "And if it doesn't break?" Marin did not answer. She did not have an answer. She looked at her son, still shaking with fever, and at Karina pressed against a barrel with her eyes closed, and at the Peebles children huddled together in the corner, and she thought about what it would mean to run out of fuel with the storm still raging. Then she fed the fire its ration and said nothing. The 7th hour brought something worse. A knock at the door, not pounding, not frantic, but slow, deliberate, mechanical. Lars opened it. A figure stood in the doorway, caked in ice, barely recognizable as human. It took Marin a moment to realize who it was. Old Man Hendricks, the bachelor who lived alone 2 miles west. He had been caught outside when the storm hit, trying to reach his barn maybe, or simply too far from his cabin to make it back. He had walked through the storm for God knew how long, navigating by instinct or luck, until he found Marin's light through the white. He collapsed inside the door and did not move. Hannah checked him while Lars closed the door against the wind. "He's alive," Hannah said. "Barely. His hands." She stopped. She did not need to finish. Marin had seen frostbite before. She knew what dead flesh looked like. "Get him warm," she said. "Slowly, not too fast. And keep him away from the stove. If he warms too quickly, the shock could kill him." They positioned Hendricks in the coolest part of the room, near the outer wall, and covered him with blankets. His breathing was shallow but steady. His eyes were closed. His hands, when Marin looked at them, were white as bone. 12 people now. 12 people in a 12 by 14 shack, surrounded by barrels of water, waiting for a storm to end. The 8th hour brought the turning point. The wind changed. Marin felt it before she heard it, a shift in the pressure, a lessening of the weight against the walls. The constant howl dropped in pitch, then dropped again. The board stopped groaning. The snow sifting through the ceiling cracks slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Lars pressed his face to the window, trying to see through the ice. "I think," he said, "I think it might be letting up." Marin did not believe it. She had seen storms lull before, false hopes that killed people who ventured out too soon. But as the minutes passed and the wind continued to fade, she began to let herself feel something that might have been relief. The fuel had held. Barely. Another hour and she would have been burning furniture. The barrels had held. She laid her hand against the one nearest the bed and felt warmth, not heat, but warmth. The water inside was still above freezing, still releasing the energy it had stored, still keeping the death at bay. And Nels's fever had broken. She discovered it in the 8th hour when she went to check on him and found his forehead cool and damp instead of burning dry. He was sleeping, really sleeping, not the fitful half-consciousness of fever, but the deep healing sleep of a body that had turned a corner. "Mama," Karina whispered. "Is he better?" "He's better." Marin pulled her daughter close and held her tight. He's going to be all right. Dawn came gray and still. The storm had blown itself out sometime in the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay in drifts 6 and 8 feet deep against the north side of the shack. The barn, there was no barn, would have been buried. The road, if there had been a road, was gone. The prairie had become a white desert, smooth and featureless under a sky the color of ash. But inside the shack, 12 people were alive. Marin opened the door and felt the cold, still brutal, still deep below zero, but calm now. Quiet. The kind of cold you could survive if you were careful, not the killing cold of the storm itself. Lars stepped outside, sinking to his waist in the drift, and began digging a path toward where his cabin would be. The older people's children followed, working in shifts, cutting a trench through the snow. Hannah stayed behind, helping Marin feed the survivors, checking on Hendrix, watching over the children who were too young or too weak to help. I didn't believe, Hannah said quietly when the others were out of earshot. When you told me about the barrels, I thought you had lost your mind. Maybe I had. Maybe you found it. Hannah looked at the barrel rows, at the warmth still radiating from the water mass, at the shack that had held when so many others had not. How many people would have died last night without this room? Marin did not answer. She did not know. But she knew that the Peebles family would have died alone in their cracked stove cabin. She knew that Hendrix would have died, wandering blind in the white. She knew that somewhere out on the prairie, in cabins without water walls and without enough fuel and without anywhere to go, people had died. Were dying still, maybe, in the places no one had found yet. Her barrels had not saved everyone, but they had saved some. And this morning, some was enough. The bodies were found on the second day after the storm. 3 families dead in their cabins. 2 more missing, presumed buried somewhere between their homesteads and wherever they had been trying to reach. Old man Hendrix lost 4 fingers and half his right ear to frostbite, but he lived. The Peebles family returned to their cabin to find it collapsed under the weight of drifted snow, the cracked stove pipe buried, everything they owned either frozen or crushed. They moved in with Marin for 2 weeks while Lars rebuilt. The shack that had been cramped with 4 people became a small village of 11. Children slept in shifts. Adults took turns standing. Meals were cooked in assembly line fashion, one pot serving everyone, rationed carefully against dwindling supplies. It should have been miserable. In some ways it was, but they were alive. And in the aftermath of January 12th, 1888, being alive felt like enough Elias Broder came on the 4th day. He rode through the drifts on a horse that looked half dead from exhaustion, picking his way across a prairie that had been transformed into a white labyrinth of snow walls and buried landmarks. He stopped in front of Marin's shack and sat his saddle for a long moment, looking at the structure that still stood when so many others had not. Then he dismounted and walked inside. The room was chaos. Children everywhere, adults pressed against walls, the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. But it was warm, impossibly, undeniably warm. Bruder stood in the doorway and felt the heat radiating from the barrel rows, felt the difference between the killing cold outside and the survivable warmth within. He crossed to the nearest barrel and laid his palm flat against the wood. Still warm, he said. 4 days after the storm. The water holds heat, Marin said. It releases it slowly. The room never crashed the way it would have without them. I know what water does. Broder's voice was strange, not angry, not dismissive, but something else. Something that might have been wonder. I've known it for 30 years. I just never thought. He stopped. He turned to face her. How cold did it get in here? At the worst of it? I don't know exactly. Cold enough that we could see our breath, not cold enough to freeze the water in the cups. And outside? 40 below, maybe. 50. The thermometer broke. Broder was silent for a long moment. He looked at the barrels, at the stove with its tin reflector, at the 11 people who had survived a night that killed so many others. Then he did something Marin had not expected. He took off his hat. I counted wood and walls, he said. I counted what I could see. I told you a cabin survives on wood, and I was right, but I was also wrong. I never counted what could hold the night back. He looked at her. I've been inspecting claims in this territory for 15 years. Mrs. Vangen, I've seen a lot of people try a lot of things. Most of them die. You didn't die. And you saved how many? 11 others? 12, counting Hendricks. 12. Broder shook his head slowly. I'll be writing a different kind of report this time. I'll be telling the territorial office what I saw here, and I'll be telling anyone who asks. He put his hat back on. You did something I didn't think was possible. I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back. If you ever need anything from me, Mrs. Vangen, anything at all, you send word. I owe you that much. He rode away into the white. Marin watched him go and felt something shift inside her chest. Not pride, exactly, but something close to it. Validation. The man who had told her she would die had come to tell her she had lived. The visitors started arriving the following week. First came the Lindqvists, from 4 miles north. Their cabin had survived the storm, but barely. The husband had spent the entire night feeding the fire, while his wife and children huddled under every blanket they owned. They had heard about the Vangen widow's barrels and wanted to see for themselves. Marin showed them. She walked them through the shack, explained the principle, demonstrated the arrangement. The wife asked questions. How many barrels? How much water? How close to the stove? The husband measured the spacing with his hands, calculating how the same system might fit in their own cabin. Then came the Andersons. Then the Muellers. Then a young school teacher named Clara Engstrom, who had nearly lost 2 students to the cold when the schoolhouse stove failed and wanted to know if there was a way to make the building safer. Each visitor brought questions. Each visitor brought doubt. And each visitor left with something that looked like hope. They're coming to you, Hannah said one evening, after the Peebles family had finally moved back to their rebuilt cabin. The whole district is coming to you. They're coming to see the barrels. They're coming to see you. Hannah sat down at the table that had been buried under people for 2 weeks, and now felt strangely empty with only 4 in the room. You survived something that killed others. You saved people who would have died without you. That means something, Marin. That changes how they see you. I don't want them to see me differently. Too late. Hannah smiled. You're the barrel woman now. You're the one who knows how to make a small room hold through the night. And whether you want it or not, people are going to keep coming to learn. Rook came less often after the storm. At first, Marin thought he was simply giving her space. The shack had been crowded enough without an extra body. But as January turned to February and his visits grew more sporadic, she began to notice other signs. He moved more slowly. His limp, which had always been pronounced, became labored. The color in his face, never healthy, turned gray. She confronted him in late February when he came to help her repair a barrel stave that had cracked in the cold. You're sick, she said. I'm old. He did not look up from his work. Old and worn out. The leg never healed right after the accident, and the rest of me has been catching up for years. Have you seen a doctor? What would a doctor tell me that I don't already know? Rook drove a wooden peg into the stave with more force than necessary. I've got maybe a year, maybe two if I'm lucky and the winters are mild. The lungs are going, the heart's not far behind. He looked at her then, and his eyes were clear and calm. I knew when I came to help you that I wouldn't be around to see many more winters. I wanted to see this one. I wanted to see if your barrels would work. They worked. They did. He smiled, the same smile he had given her months ago when he told her she was thinking in systems. You did something I never did, Mrs. Vangen. I spent 22 years learning about heat and cold, and I never built anything with that knowledge. I kept other people's boilers running. I kept other people's mills warm. But I never took what I knew and made something new. He set down his hammer. You did. You took an idea and a pile of broken barrels and you built something that saved lives. That's worth more than anything I ever did. Maren did not know what to say. She had come to rely on Rook, his knowledge, his steadiness, his way of making the impossible seem merely difficult. The thought of losing him felt like losing a wall of her shack, something structural and essential. Teach me more, she said. Whatever you know that I don't, teach me before. She stopped. Before I die? Rook laughed, a dry sound like rustling paper. That's the plan. I've got notebooks full of things I learned in the boiler house. Diagrams, calculations, principles. Most of it's useless to most people, but you, he pointed at her, you might actually understand it. Then start teaching. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight I'm tired, but tomorrow we'll start with the notebooks. The notebooks were a revelation. Rook had spent 2 decades recording everything he learned about heat, fuel, and the movement of energy through materials. His handwriting was cramped and difficult, his diagrams rough, but the information was extraordinary. Methods for calculating heat loss through different wall materials. Tables showing burn rates for different fuels at different temperatures. Sketches of reflector arrangements, flue designs, firebox modifications. Maren spent hours each evening copying the most relevant sections into her own notebook, asking questions when she didn't understand, arguing when she thought Rook was wrong. You're stubborn, he said one evening, after she had challenged his estimate of heat transfer through sawed walls. I'm trying to understand. You're trying to do more than understand. You're trying to improve. He leaned back in his chair, the chair that had belonged to Torstein, that now belonged to no one and everyone. That's good. That's what I hoped you'd do. Take what I know, add what you know, and build something better than either of us could build alone. Is that what you wanted when you first came to help me? Rook was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February wind moaned against the walls, but inside the barrels held their warmth and the room stayed comfortable. I wanted to see if you could do it, he said finally. You were trying something I'd never seen anyone try. Most people, when they face a problem like yours, they do what everyone else does. They try to get more wood. They try to build thicker walls. They work harder at the same solutions that have always failed because they can't imagine anything different. He looked at her. You imagined something different. I wanted to see where that went. And now? Now I want to make sure it doesn't die with you. He tapped his notebook. I'm going to teach you everything I know, and you're going to teach it to anyone who asks. That's how knowledge survives, Mrs. Vangen. Not in books, not in buildings, in people who care enough to pass it on. The disagreement came in March. Spring was approaching. The snow had begun to melt. The days were growing longer, and the desperate urgency of winter was fading into something like ordinary life. Maren had begun to think about next year, about improvements, about ways to make the system better. Larger barrels, she said, closer to the stove. I could increase the heat absorption by. No. She looked up. Rook rarely interrupted her, and he never said no without explanation. No? She repeated. Closer to the stove means higher risk of fire. Wood barrels near open flames, I've seen it happen. A spark gets through, the stave catches, and suddenly you're not heating your room, you're burning it down. He shook his head. The distance I showed you is the minimum safe distance. Push past it, and you're trading one kind of death for another. But the efficiency. Efficiency is meaningless if you're dead. His voice was sharp. Listen to me, Marin. I've watched men die because they push systems too hard. Boilers that exploded because someone wanted more pressure. Mills that burned because someone wanted more heat. The margin of safety exists for a reason. You do not cross it. Marin felt her face flush. She was not used to being corrected. Not anymore. Not after surviving what she had survived. I know what I'm doing, she said. You know some of what you're doing. You don't know everything. No one does. Rook's expression softened. I'm not trying to hold you back. I'm trying to keep you from killing yourself and your children through overconfidence. The system works. It saved lives. Don't ruin it by trying to make it perfect. The words stung because they were true. Marin sat in silence, turning them over, feeling the weight of her own pride pressing against them. I'm sorry, she said finally. You're right. I'll keep the distance. Good. Rook nodded. Now let's talk about something you can improve. The barrel arrangement in the loft space. I have some ideas about secondary heat capture that might work for you. Rook died in April. It happened quietly, the way he would have wanted. He went to sleep one night in his cabin on the East Fork and did not wake up. His nearest neighbor found him 2 days later, still in his bed, his face peaceful, his hands folded across his chest as if he had known the end was coming and had prepared for it. Marin was not there. She learned of his death from a rider who came to tell her, a young man she did not recognize who delivered the news like a telegram and then rode away. She stood in the doorway of her shack for a long time after he left, looking out at the prairie that was beginning to turn green, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on her face. The children were playing somewhere behind the cabin. The barrels stood along the walls, empty now, drained for the season. The stove was cold. She had known this was coming. Rook had told her himself months ago that he would not see many more winters, but knowing did not make it easier. Knowing did not fill the space he had left behind. She walked inside and found the notebook, the one he had given her, filled with his cramped handwriting and rough diagrams and years of accumulated knowledge. She opened it to the last page he had written, a note she had not seen before. Any fool can make heat. Wisdom is deciding where it waits. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. Then she sat down at the table and let herself weep. The silence after grief is not empty. It is full of everything that can no longer be said. Marin carried that fullness through the spring. She worked her claim. She fed her children. She maintained her barrels, checking seams and hoops, preparing them for another year. She answered the questions of visitors who still came, still curious, still wanting to learn. And she taught the way Rook had taught her, not through lectures, but through action, through demonstration, through the patient transfer of knowledge from hands that knew to hands that wanted to know. But something had changed. Something had hardened. She was alone now in a way she had not been before. Torstein was dead. Rook was dead. She had her children, her neighbors, her growing reputation as the woman who knew how to survive. But the people who had understood her best, who had seen past the barrels to the mind that conceived them, were gone. She would have to be her own mentor now, her own teacher, her own measure of what was possible. It was a lonely kind of freedom. But it was freedom nonetheless. The secondary crisis came in late May. A family named Holstad had settled 15 miles west of the district, too far for regular contact, too isolated for the community network that had developed around Marin's method. They had arrived the previous autumn, too late to prepare properly, and had survived the winter through sheer stubbornness and luck. Their luck ran out in May. A rider brought the news. The Holstad mother had given birth during the night, but something had gone wrong. She was bleeding, unable to stand, growing weaker by the hour. The father had ridden for help, leaving his wife and newborn with his 12-year-old daughter and no one else. The district had no doctor. The nearest surgeon was in Sioux Falls, 2 days' ride away. By the time anyone could bring professional help, the woman would likely be dead. Hannah came to Marin's door with the news and a question. "Will you come?" "I'm not a midwife." "Neither am I. Neither is anyone else within a day's ride." Hannah's face was drawn. "But you know how to think through problems. You know how to improvise. And that woman is going to die if someone doesn't do something." Marin thought about her children. Nels, 11 now, responsible enough to watch Karina for a day. She thought about her claim, her work, her comfortable distance from other people's crises. She thought about Rook, who had helped her when he had no reason to, simply because he wanted to see if her idea would work. "I'll come," she said. The Holstad claim was a desperate place. The cabin was smaller than Marin's shack, barely 10 feet square, with a sod roof that leaked and a stove that had burned through half its firebox. The mother, her name was Ingrid, lay on a pallet in the corner, pale as snow, her breath shallow, her eyes glazed. Beside her, the newborn slept in a crate lined with rags. The 12-year-old daughter, Astrid, stood guard over both of them with the hollow-eyed vigilance of a child forced to become an adult overnight. Marin assessed the situation. Postpartum bleeding, probably from a tear that hadn't sealed properly. Not uncommon, not always fatal. But without intervention, without pressure and warmth and fluids, it would kill Ingrid Holstad within hours. She did not have the tools of a doctor. She did not have the training of a midwife. But she had hands, and she had knowledge, and she had the same ruthless practicality that had kept her children alive through January 12th. She worked through the afternoon, pressure on the wound, clean cloths boiled in water. Warmth, she stoked the failing stove and positioned Ingrid close to it. Fluids, weak tea, broth, anything the woman could swallow. Rest, she banished the hovering husband to the barn and told Astrid to sleep. By evening, the bleeding had slowed. By midnight, Ingrid's color had begun to return. By dawn, she was able to sit up and hold her baby. Marin sat outside the cabin as the sun rose, exhausted beyond words, her hands still stained with other women's blood. She had done something she had not known she could do. She had stepped into a crisis that was not hers and used what she had to change its outcome. This, too, was a kind of system. Knowledge applied to need. Effort directed at survival. The same principle that had filled her barrels with water and kept her children warm through the long night. She was more than the barrel woman now. She was something she did not yet have a name for. 4. If this story of one woman's transformation from widow to teacher to healer reminds you why knowledge matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Silas Creel had not gone away. The hostile skeptic had spent the winter nursing his grievances and spreading his doubts. The storm of January 12th had embarrassed him. His own cabin had nearly frozen, forcing him to burn furniture and inventory to survive. But embarrassment had not changed his nature. If anything, it had sharpened it. Now, in the spring that followed Marin's growing reputation, Creel saw his position threatened. People who trusted the barrel woman did not need to buy his overpriced fuel. People who learned to manage their heat did not fall prey to his predatory notes. Every family that adopted Marin's methods was a family that slipped out of his grip. He began a campaign. Dangerous dampness, he told anyone who would listen. She's teaching people to fill their homes with water. Water breeds mold. Mold breeds sickness. By next winter, half the district will be coughing blood. The accusation found some purchase. People who had not seen Marin's system, who had only heard about it third hand, began to wonder. Was it safe? Was it proven? Was the widow selling false hope to desperate families? Marin heard the whispers and ignored them. She had survived too much to be wounded by words. But then Creel escalated. He came to her claim in early June, when the barrels were empty and the stove was cold, and the shack looked like any other homesteader's cabin. He came with 2 men from the territorial office, clerks or inspectors or something in between, and a document that he waved like a weapon. Health complaint, he said, smiling his cold smile. Multiple residents of this district have expressed concern about the sanitary conditions of your dwelling, water storage and living spaces, potential for contamination, risk of disease transmission. He handed the document to one of the clerks. These gentlemen are here to inspect. Marin looked at the document. It was official-looking, stamped and signed, heavy with bureaucratic weight. She looked at the 2 clerks, who seemed uncomfortable but determined. She looked at Creel, whose smile had widened. "Inspect what?" she said. "The barrels are empty. The water's been drained since March." "Empty now, full in winter. The complaint addresses the conditions during the heating season." Creel's voice was smooth as oil. "These gentlemen will examine your dwelling, document what they find, and report to the Territorial Health Board. If the board determines that your methods pose a risk to public health," he paused for effect, "you may be required to cease sharing them with others." It was a clever attack. Creel couldn't stop Marin from using the barrels herself. That was her right as a homesteader. But he could try to stop her from teaching others. He could try to strangle the knowledge before it spread further. "Fine," Marin said. "Inspect." She stepped aside and let the clerks enter her shack. They poked at the barrel positions. They examined the floor for rot. They looked at the ceiling for mold, at the walls for damp, at every corner and crack for evidence of the contamination Creel had promised them. They found nothing. The floor was solid. Rook's bracing had held, and she had reinforced it further over the winter. The walls were dry. The ceiling showed no sign of mold or moisture damage. The barrels themselves, empty and clean, sat against the walls like silent witnesses to their own innocence. The inspection took an hour. The clerks filled out their forms, made their notes, and prepared to leave. "Well?" Creel demanded. The senior clerk looked at his notes, then at Marin, then at Creel. "We find no evidence of unsanitary conditions," he said. "The dwelling appears to be well maintained and properly ventilated. The water storage method, as described by Mrs. Vangen, does not appear to pose a health risk when implemented correctly." "That's impossible. The barrels, the damp." "Mr. Creel." The clerk's voice had gone cold. "We were told we would find a health hazard. We did not. We were told we would find evidence of negligence. We did not." He gathered his papers. "If you have further concerns, you may file another complaint, but I would suggest in the future that you not waste the territorial office's time with unfounded accusations." The clerks left. Creel stood in Marin's doorway, his face flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is." Marin's voice was calm. "You tried to stop me with mockery. That didn't work. You tried to stop me with economics. That didn't work either. Now you've tried to stop me with bureaucracy, and it's failed too." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the anger in his eyes. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Creel. I'm just a widow trying to keep her children warm. But if you keep coming after me, you're going to find that I don't break as easily as you think. Creel said nothing. He turned and walked to his wagon, climbed onto the seat, and drove away without looking back. Myron watched him go. She knew he was not finished. Men like Creel were never finished until they had nothing left to lose. But she also knew that his power over her was fading. Every family he had tried to trap was now learning to survive without his help. Every attack he launched only made her reputation stronger. He had tried to make her an example of failure. Instead, he had made her a symbol of resistance. Summer brought new visitors and new questions. Word of the Barrel Woman had spread beyond the district, carried by travelers and traders and the slow currents of frontier gossip. People came from 20 miles away, from 30, wanting to see the shack that had held through January 12th, wanting to learn the method that had saved 12 lives. Marin taught them all. She showed them how to assess barrels for rot, how to pitch seams and tighten hoops, how to brace a floor for the weight of water, how to position the mass for maximum heat absorption without risking fire, how to manage a stove through the long night, feeding it just enough to keep the pipe warm without wasting precious fuel. Not everyone could implement the full system. Some lived in cabins too small for 20 barrels. Some had floors too weak to bear the weight. Some had stoves too far from the walls to make the arrangement practical. But Marin taught them anyway, adapting the principles to their circumstances, showing them how to use what they had, crocks, water tubs, even heated stones, to create smaller-scale versions of the same effect. It's not about the barrels, she told a young wife from 30 miles north, who had arrived with a wagon full of questions and not much else. The barrels are just one way to solve the problem. The real principle is simpler. Store heat during the day, release it at night, slow down the rate at which your room loses warmth. Anything that holds heat longer than air will help. Water is just the most efficient option I could afford. The young wife nodded, scribbling notes in a small book. What if I can't afford barrels? Then use what you can afford. Crocks filled with water, stones heated on the stove and wrapped in cloth, a cast iron pot filled with sand, warm during the day and placed near the bed at night. Marin leaned forward. The frontier isn't about having the best tools. It's about using the tools you have. If you understand the principle, you can improvise the method. The young wife left with a notebook full of ideas and a determination that Marin recognized. She had worn that same expression once, standing in the doorway of a shack that everyone said would kill her. By late summer, Marin had taught more than 40 families. Some had implemented full barrel systems. Others had adapted the principle to their circumstances. All of them had left with knowledge they had not possessed before, knowledge that might mean the difference between life and death when the next hard winter came. She had not charged for any of it. She had not asked for payment or barter or trade. Rook had given his knowledge freely, and she did the same. "You're losing money," Hannah said one evening, sitting on Marin's porch as the summer sun set orange over the prairie. "You could charge for lessons. People would pay." People would also not come if they couldn't pay. Marin watched her children playing in the grass. Nell's tall and serious, Karina bright and wild. The whole point is to spread the knowledge. If I charge for it, only the wealthy learn, and the wealthy don't need my help. The wealthy need your help more than anyone. You've seen how they winter, big houses, thin walls, stoves they can barely feed. Then they can come and learn for free, like everyone else. Marin smiled. "I'm not trying to build a business, Hannah. I'm trying to keep people alive. There's a difference." Hannah shook her head, but she was smiling too. "You're a strange woman, Marin Vangen." "I've been told." The autumn brought preparation and memory. Marin spent September filling her barrels again, hauling water from the creek bucket by bucket, checking seams and hoops and positions. The work was familiar now, a ritual almost, and she found comfort in its rhythms. But she also found herself thinking about the people she had lost. Torstein, who had built this claim and died before he could see what it became. Rook, who had taught her to think in systems and left her his notebooks as a final gift. The strangers who had frozen on January 12th, in cabins without water walls and without hope. She could not bring any of them back, but she could honor them by continuing to teach, continuing to share, continuing to build on what they had left behind. "Mama," Karina said one evening, watching her mother work, "why do you help all those people?" Marin paused, a bucket of water in her hands. "Because someone helped me once," she said. "And because if I don't, some of them will die." "Is that the only reason?" Marin considered the question. It was a good question, better than Karina probably knew. "No," she said finally. "I also do it because it matters, because the knowledge I have could save lives. And keeping it to myself would be," she searched for the word wrong, like hoarding food while your neighbors starve. "The knowledge isn't mine to keep. It belongs to anyone who needs it." Karina thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Can I help you fill the barrels?" Marin smiled. "Yes, you can help." They worked together until dark, mother and daughter, filling the water wall that would hold them through another winter. And when the last barrel was full and the room was warm and the children were asleep, Marin sat alone at the table and opened Rook's notebook to the page she had read 100 times. "Any fool can make heat. Wisdom is deciding where it waits," she had decided. The wisdom was waiting in 40 families spreading across the prairie, taking root in cabins and shacks and sod houses that might otherwise have become graves. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Chunk 4 continues. The second winter was easier, not because the cold was gentler, it was not. December of 1888 brought temperatures that rivaled the year before, bitter winds that scoured the prairie and piled snow against cabin walls. But Marin faced it differently now. She faced it with knowledge, with preparation, with the calm certainty of someone who had already survived the worst. Her barrels stood ready by October. Her fuel supply, carefully managed through the year, exceeded even Elias Broder's minimum recommendations. Her stove, repositioned and reflected, threw heat into the room with efficient purpose. And her children, Nels at 11, Karina at 8, had learned to help with the maintenance, checking seams and monitoring temperatures and feeding the fire through the night in careful rotation. They were not merely surviving anymore. They were thriving. The visitors continued through the winter, though fewer made the journey through the snow. Those who came were serious, families who had implemented their own versions of the system and wanted to compare notes, to share what they had learned, to ask questions about problems they had encountered. A farmer from 20 miles east had discovered that his barrels worked better when raised slightly off the floor on wooden blocks. The air circulation underneath prevented ice from forming at the base. A widow from the north had adapted the principle to her root cellar, using water-filled crocks to moderate temperature swings and keep her vegetables from freezing. A schoolteacher, Clara Engstrom, who had nearly lost students the year before, had installed 4 large barrels at the back of her schoolhouse and reported that the building now held heat for hours after the morning fire died. Each visitor brought something new. Each visitor took something away. The knowledge was spreading, mutating, adapting to different circumstances and different needs. Marin was no longer the sole keeper of the method. She was becoming something else, a node in a network, a teacher among teachers, a source that fed 100 streams. "You've started something," Hannah said during a February visit, warming her hands by Marin's stove. "Something bigger than you probably meant to start." "I only meant to keep my children warm. And now you're keeping half the district warm," maybe more than half. Hannah looked around the room at the barrels, the stove, the children doing their evening chores. Do you ever think about what happens next, after you're gone? Maren had thought about it. She thought about it more often now, since Rook's death, since the realization that knowledge could die as easily as people. The notebooks help, she said. I've been copying everything. Rook's notes, my own observations, the improvements other people have shared. If something happens to me, the knowledge survives. Notebooks can burn. So can people, but we keep having children anyway. Maren smiled. The knowledge is in too many heads now to disappear. Even if every notebook burned, even if I died tomorrow, someone would remember, someone would teach their children, the chain would continue. That's a lot of faith in people. It's faith in what people do when they're desperate. They learn, they adapt, they survive. Maren looked at the barrels that had saved her life, at the system that had spread across the prairie like water finding its level. I didn't invent anything new, Hannah. I just remembered something old and applied it differently. Someone else would have figured it out eventually. I just happened to be the one who needed it badly enough. The hostile skeptic's end came in March. Silas Creel had spent another winter nursing his grievances, watching his business shrink as more families learned to manage their heat without his predatory assistance. The fuel notes that had once been his primary income had dried up. The emergency purchases that had enriched him during cold snaps had become rare. The power he had wielded over desperate homesteaders was slipping through his fingers like sand. And then his own roof caved in. Not literally, though the metaphor was apt. What happened was simpler and more humiliating. A late-season cold snap caught Creel unprepared. His own storeroom, poorly insulated and carelessly maintained, froze solid overnight. His merchandise, the flour and seed and hardware that constituted his livelihood, was damaged beyond salvage. And his back sleeping room, where his grandchildren stayed during their visits from Sioux Falls, dropped to temperatures that endangered anyone who tried to sleep there. Creel had two choices. He could let his grandchildren freeze, or he could ask for help. He appeared at Maren's door on a Tuesday morning, his face a mask of suppressed fury and forced humility. He did not knock. He stood in the yard and waited until she noticed him through the window. She went outside to meet him. She did not invite him in. "Mrs. Vangen," he said. "Mr. Creel." The silence between them stretched. Creel's jaw worked, as if he were chewing words he could not bring himself to swallow. He stopped. Started again. "My grandchildren are visiting next month. The back room, the room where they sleep, it doesn't hold heat. I've tried." He stopped again. "I don't know how to fix it." Maren waited. She did not speak. She did not help him find the words. "I'm asking," Creel said finally. The admission dragged out of him like a splinter from flesh. "For your advice on how to make the room warmer, on how to—" His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "On how to do what you do." Maren looked at the man who had mocked her, threatened her, tried to destroy her reputation, and attempted to have her methods banned by the territorial government. She looked at his clenched fists and his rigid posture and his eyes that could not quite meet hers. She could have refused. She could have told him to suffer the way he had wanted her to suffer. She could have taken revenge for every insult, every threat, every attempt to profit from her desperation. She thought about Rook, who had helped her for no reason except that he wanted to see if her idea would work. She thought about the families who had survived January 12th because she had shared what she knew without asking what they could give in return. She thought about the kind of person she wanted to be and the kind of world she wanted to leave behind. "Come inside," she said. "I'll draw you a diagram." She spent an hour teaching Silas Creel, She did not soften the lesson or make it easy. She explained the principles the same way she explained them to everyone, clearly, precisely, without condescension or mercy. She drew the same diagrams, cited the same measurements, described the same techniques for pitching seams and bracing floors, and positioning mass for maximum heat absorption. Creel listened. He took notes in a small leather book, his handwriting cramped and hurried. He asked questions, grudging questions, forced out against his will, and accepted her answers without argument. When the lesson was done, he stood to leave. He paused at the door. "I was wrong about you," he said. The words sounded like they cost him something. "I was wrong about the barrels. I was wrong about—" He stopped. "I was wrong." "Yes," Marin said. "You were. Why did you help me? After everything I did?" Marin considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "Because your grandchildren didn't do anything to me," she said. "And because the knowledge isn't mine to keep. It belongs to anyone who needs it, even people I don't like." Creel stood in the doorway for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once sharply and walked away. He never apologized. He never acknowledged publicly that he had been wrong, but he also never attacked Marin again. He implemented her suggestions in his back room, and when his grandchildren visited, they slept warm through the night. And sometimes, when new settlers came to the district asking about winter survival, Creel would direct them to the Vangen claim without comment or complaint. It was not forgiveness, it was not friendship, but it was peace of a kind. And on the frontier, peace was enough. Jonas Ide arrived in the spring of 1889. He came to repair barrel hoops. That was the official reason 3 of Marin's barrels had developed loose bands over the winter, and she needed a cooper's skill to tighten them properly. Someone in the district had mentioned a widowed craftsman who had set up shop near the creek crossing, a man who knew wood and metal and the ways they fit together. Jonas was 41 years old, 10 years older than Marin, with a face that had been weathered by work and grief in equal measure. His wife had died of fever 2 years earlier, leaving him alone with a trade and nothing much else. He had come west to start over, the way so many came west, looking for a second chance in a place where first chances had already been spent. He arrived at Marin's claim on a mild April morning, his tools in a canvas bag, his manner quiet and watchful. He looked at the barrels the way Rook had looked at them, not with skepticism, but with the assessing eye of someone who understood systems. "You're the barrel woman," he said. "I'm Marin Vangen." "I know." He walked to the nearest barrel and ran his hand along the stave. "I've heard the stories. 40 families taught, 12 lives saved in the big storm. The woman who thinks in systems." He looked at her. "I wanted to see it for myself. And I'm impressed." He pulled a tool from his bag, a specialized hammer with a curved head. "These hoops are loose because the wood shrank over the winter. It happens. I can tighten them, but they'll loosen again unless you treat the staves with linseed oil before next season. Keeps the wood from drying out." Rook never mentioned that. Rook was a boiler man. "I'm a cooper." Jonas smiled, the first smile she had seen from him. Different trades, different knowledge. That's how it works. He spent the morning tightening hoops and explaining the properties of wood, how it expanded and contracted with moisture, how different species behaved differently, how the grain direction affected strength and flexibility. Marin listened and asked questions, the same way she had listened to Rook, the same way she listened to anyone who knew things she did not. By afternoon, the barrels were repaired. Jonas gathered his tools and prepared to leave. "What do I owe you?" Marin asked. "Nothing." "I can pay." "I know." He slung his bag over his shoulder. "But I didn't come for money." I came because I wanted to meet the woman who figured out what half the district couldn't figure out. I came because I wanted to see how you think. He paused. I'd like to come back, if you don't mind. I have ideas about the barrel arrangement that might interest you. Marin studied him, this quiet widower with his weathered face and his careful hands and his knowledge of wood and systems. She saw something in him that reminded her of Rook, a mind that worked the same way hers did, that saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than fates to be accepted. Come back tomorrow, she said. We can talk about your ideas. He came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. The partnership grew slowly, the way frontier things often grew, through shared work rather than spoken feelings, through collaboration rather than courtship. Jonas helped Marin refine her barrel system, suggesting improvements based on his knowledge of wood and joinery. She helped him understand the thermal principles that Rook had taught her, translating the boilerman's notebooks into terms a cooper could use. They argued about methodology. They debated design choices. They tested ideas against each other the way flint tests steel, striking sparks that sometimes caught fire and sometimes did not. And somewhere in the arguing and debating and testing, something else began to grow. Nels noticed it first. Mr. Idy comes by a lot, he said one evening, in the careful voice of a 12-year-old who has figured something out but is not sure he should say it. He's helping with the barrels. The barrels have been fixed for weeks. Marin did not have an answer to that, or rather she had an answer, but she was not ready to speak it aloud. Karina noticed it next. Is Mr. Idy going to live with us? She asked, with the directness of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to be indirect. I don't know, Marin said. Would you like him to? Karina considered this seriously. He knows how to make things, and he doesn't talk too much, and he makes you smile. She nodded. I think I would like it. They married in June of 1890, 3 years after Thorstein's death. It was a small ceremony. The minister from the settlement, a handful of neighbors, the children standing as witnesses. There was no fanfare, no celebration, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was. Two people who had lost their first partners finding something new in each other. Jonas moved into the claim. He built an addition to the shack, a proper bedroom with walls thick enough to hold heat and windows positioned for light rather than cold. He built a workshop behind the cabin where he could practice his trade. He built furniture, shelves, storage systems that made the small space feel larger than it was. And he built barrels. Better barrels designed specifically for thermal storage, tight-grained oak with reinforced hoops, treated with linseed oil to prevent shrinkage, sized to maximize capacity while minimizing floor space. The Vangen-Ide barrels, as people began to call them, became a minor commodity in the district. Not expensive, Marin refused to profit from knowledge that should be free, but available for anyone who wanted them, at a price that covered materials and labor and nothing more. You could charge more, Jonas said one evening, after completing an order for a family 30 miles west. People would pay. People who could pay would pay. People who couldn't would die. Marin shook her head. We have enough. The claim is proved up. The children are fed. The barrels keep us warm. What more do we need? Nothing, Jonas said after a moment. Nothing more than this. The years compressed the way frontier years always did, measured not in calendars but in children grown, and winter survived and neighbors buried, and new neighbors arrived to take their place. Nels grew tall and serious, with his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness. He learned the barrel trade from Jonas and the thermal principles from Marin, and by 18 he was teaching other young men the way his mother had taught their parents. He married a school teacher's daughter and built a claim of his own 10 miles east, close enough to visit, but far enough to be independent. Karina grew bright and fierce, with a mind that reminded Marin of herself at that age, always questioning, always testing, never satisfied with answers that didn't make sense. She left for Sioux Falls at 17 to study with a pharmacist, and returned 3 years later with knowledge of medicine and chemistry that made her the closest thing the district had to a doctor. She never married, but she never seemed lonely either. Her work was enough. Marin and Jonas had no children together. They had discussed it early in their marriage and decided they were content with what they had. The family was complete. The work was enough. The teaching continued. Families came and learned and went away with knowledge. The notebooks multiplied. Rook's original, Marin's additions, Jonas's contributions, observations from dozens of families who had implemented the system and found ways to improve it. By the time Marin was 50, the knowledge had spread across 3 territories and into regions she had never seen. She did not know all the people she had saved. She could not count all the cabins that stayed warm because of what she had taught. But sometimes, in the letters that arrived from distant places, she caught glimpses of the network she had helped create. A family in Montana who had survived a blizzard using the barrel method, a settlement in Minnesota where the schoolhouse used thermal mass to stay warm through the coldest months, a town in Nebraska where the general store stocked Vangan 80 barrels as standard winter equipment. The knowledge had escaped her. It belonged to the world now, spreading and changing and adapting in ways she could not control and did not try to. That was enough. That was more than enough. Elias Broder died in 1902 at the age of 78. Marin learned of his death from a letter sent by his grandson, a young man she had never met, who had heard stories about the barrel woman his grandfather had once condemned and later praised. "He spoke of you often," the letter said. "He said you taught him that survival could be imagined, not just endured. He said you changed the way he thought about what was possible." Marin kept the letter in Rook's notebook, alongside the diagrams and calculations and the final message he had left her. "Any fool can make heat. Wisdom is deciding where it waits." She was 63 when the letter arrived. Jonas was 68, slowing down, his hands less steady than they had once been, but his mind still sharp. They had been married for 12 years. They had built something together, not just a home, but a way of living that had spread across the prairie like ripples from a stone. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked one evening, sitting on the porch of the home he had built, watching the sun set over the land they had worked together. "Giving the knowledge away? You could have been wealthy. You could have patented the design, charged for lessons, built a business. I could have." Marin watched the same sunset, feeling the warmth of the evening air, hearing the sounds of the prairie settling into night. But then the knowledge would have belonged to me instead of to everyone. And when I died, it would have died with me. It still might. It won't. She was certain of this, as certain as she had been of the barrels all those years ago. It's in too many hands now, too many heads, too many cabins and shacks and schoolhouses across too many miles of prairie. Even if every notebook burned, even if everyone who ever met me forgot my name, the knowledge would survive. Because it works, and things that work get passed on. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm glad I met you, Marin Vangan." Marin Vangan Ida now. Marin Vangan Ida. He smiled. "I'm glad I met you. I'm glad I came to fix those hoops. I'm glad you came back the next day. I had ideas about the barrel arrangement. I remember." She took his hand, the weathered, skilled hand of a man who had spent his life making things fit together. "I'm glad you stayed." Maren Halvorsdatter Vangen Ida died in the spring of 1918 at the age of 63. She had lived longer than most frontier women of her generation. She had buried 2 husbands. Jonas had passed 3 years earlier, quietly, in his sleep, and raised 2 children who had raised children of their own. She had taught more people than she could count, and saved more lives than she would ever know. She died in the cabin she had fought to save, in the room where the barrels had stood, in the bed that had held her through 40 winters. Karina was with her at the end, holding her hand, telling her that everything would be all right. "The notebooks," Maren said near the end. "Make sure." "I know," Karina said. "I'll make sure." The notebooks survived. The knowledge survived. And somewhere on the prairie, in cabins and shacks and homes that Maren had never seen, families were preparing for another winter the way she had taught them, filling barrels, checking seams, positioning mass for maximum heat absorption, storing the warmth of the day against the cold of the night. 67 families in the district learned the barrel method directly from Maren Vangen Ide in the years between 1888 and 1910. The knowledge spread from those families to others, neighbors and relatives and travelers, who carried the principles across territorial lines and state borders. By the time of her death, the thermal mass technique had been documented in agricultural journals, taught in rural schools, and adapted for use in structures ranging from one-room cabins to multi-story farmhouses. No one kept count of the lives saved by knowledge that had begun in a 12-by-14 shack on the Dakota prairie. Maren lived out her final years on the claim she had fought to keep. She was known in the district as a teacher, a healer, and occasionally as a stubborn woman who refused to charge for knowledge that others would have sold. She was not wealthy. She was not famous beyond the borders of the territory. But she was respected, the kind of respect that comes from having done something difficult and having shared it freely with anyone who needed it. She was buried beside Jonas in the small cemetery outside the settlement, under a stone that read only her name and dates. She had requested no epitaph. She said the notebooks were epitaph enough. On January 12, 1888, Elias Broder had stood in Maren Vangen's doorway and delivered his verdict. "When your stove dies, Moich," he had said, "that wet wall will turn your bed into a grave and take the boy with you." The temperature had dropped 60 degrees in 6 hours that day. The wind had howled. The cold had killed 3 families in the district and countless others across the plains. But in a 12-by-14 shack lined with 20 barrels of water, a widow and her children had survived the night. The boy had lived. The bed had stayed warm. And when dawn came gray and still over the frozen prairie, Maren Vangen had laid her hand against a barrel that was no longer hot, but still giving back the last of yesterday's fire, and known that Elias Broder had been wrong about everything that mattered,